I'm going to say something that will sound unscientific, and I want to say up front that I don't mean it in a supernatural sense or as a feel-good idea about the universe caring about your life. I mean it as a psychological observation, the kind Jung spent 30 years trying to give precise language to, carefully, rigorously, waiting until he had the framework solid before he published it. Some people can make themselves felt in your mind even when they're not present, not through anything they do consciously, not through a message, not through a call, not through the ordinary transmission of information from one person to another, just through something that arrives in you, a thought, a quality of feeling, a shift in attention that turns out in retrospect to correspond with something happening on their end. Jung didn't find this mystical. He found it interesting, and he thought dismissing it entirely was a form of intellectual laziness, a refusal to look carefully at what was actually occurring. He was 67 years old when he formally published his essay on synchronicity. He'd been working toward the idea for decades, but he was deliberate about the timing. He partnered with Wolfgang Pauli, Nobel laureate in physics, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, to develop the theoretical scaffolding. This was not a man rushing to validate mysticism. This was a scientist who had observed something repeatedly, found it inconvenient to explain, and refused to put it in a drawer because inconvenient things are still real. What he argued at its core was this: at the deepest layer of the unconscious, what he called the collective unconscious. The boundary between your inner world and someone else's is not airtight. In his later work, he introduced the concept of the psychoid, the level of the archetype that is not purely mental. His formulation was precise. At a certain depth, psyche and physical reality are not two separate things. They are continuous. And at that depth, under the right conditions, with the right relational charge, something can pass between two people that ordinary cause and effect can't account for. He borrowed a term from the anthropologist Levi Bruhl to describe the mechanism: participation mystique, the unconscious interpenetration of two psychic fields. Not telepathy in the dramatic sense, not mind reading, something quieter and less legible than that. The porousness of inner life when the connection between two people is genuine. Three things tend to happen when it does. The first is the thought that arrives without cause. Not the thought you have about someone because you saw something that reminded you of them. Not the memory that surfaces because a particular song or season or quality of afternoon has returned. Something cleaner than that. And stranger. The person simply appears in your mind, without association, without chain, without the usual machinery of memory working to bring them there. They're just present suddenly with a specific quality that ordinary thoughts don't carry. The cognitive explanation is that the mind is always free associating below the threshold of awareness, and that every thought has a prior cause, even if we can't trace it. That may be true, but that explanation doesn't account for the particular texture of certain intrusions, the ones that don't feel like retrieval, that feel more like arrival, the ones you notice precisely because they have no source you can identify. Jung's framework gives this a different name. A feeling-toned complex, the psychological cluster organized around an emotionally significant relationship, carries autonomous energy. It doesn't wait for your permission to activate. Under certain conditions, when the other person's own psychic state engages the same relational field, there can be a resonance. The complex in you stirs because the complex in them has moved. The thought that came without cause may not have come from you. The second sign is the one the body knows before the mind does. A restlessness without a clear source. A warmth in the chest that isn't anxiety. A sudden quality of attention with no obvious object. The sense of being looked at, or of something at the edge of awareness that hasn't fully announced itself. Not dramatic, not intrusive, just a quiet shift, the kind you'd normally explain away before you'd finished noticing it. Jung worked extensively with what he called the psychoid, the layer of the unconscious where, in his words, the archetype is both spirit and body. His argument was that the deepest structures of the psyche express themselves simultaneously as mental states and as somatic signals, not metaphorically, literally. The boundary between psychic event and physical event dissolves at a certain depth. Your nervous system is an older instrument than your conscious mind by hundreds of millions of years. It learned to register presence, danger, closeness, and connection long before the cortex was equipped to evaluate any of it. What neuroscience would call interoception, the body's internal sensing of its own state, is in many ways a faster, less filtered channel than conscious thought. The body doesn't wait for interpretation. It responds. When someone is holding you in their attention, with real weight, with genuine feeling, the signal that reaches you may arrive in the body before it surfaces in thought. Quietly. A shift in the texture of a room. A quality of stillness that isn't emptiness. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as nothing if you weren't paying a certain kind of attention. The third sign is the dream that carries someone's weight. Not necessarily the dream where they appear clearly, playing a legible role in a narrative you can follow. Something less visible than that. You wake from a dream whose images are already dissolving, and what remains is not a scene, but an atmosphere. And the atmosphere belongs specifically to one person. Their particular emotional weight. The quality of something unresolved between you. The specific ache of missing someone in a way that could only be about them. Jung wrote that the dream is the unconscious mind's spontaneous self-portrait, the psyche staging, in symbolic form, its actual situation beneath the surface of waking life. But in the collective unconscious, the layer where personal boundaries begin to thin, where the psyches of people genuinely connected can overlap, the dream doesn't draw a clean line between what's yours and what has arrived from somewhere else. If someone is carrying you in their thoughts with enough real feeling, that quality can enter a dream not as their image, but as a presence, a residue, something that persists after the images are gone, that you recognize before you've consciously named it. You wake, and you already know whose it was. I want to be honest about where I personally land on this. I'm not someone who moves easily toward unexplained things. Years of hospice work teaches you a particular kind of precision about what can be known and what can't. I've sat with enough deaths to know the difference between what's real and what people construct because they need it to be real. But there was a period after my father died when I kept returning to something I didn't have a clean explanation for. He wasn't ill when it happened. There was no reason for me to be thinking about him more than usual, but in the weeks before, I kept finding my attention pulled in his direction. Not with grief, because there was nothing to grieve yet, but with something more like urgency. The feeling of conversations unfinished, things I'd meant to say and kept deferring. I wasn't consciously aware of any particular concern. It was more like a low-frequency signal I kept registering without being able to identify the source. I don't know what that meant. I'm not claiming it meant anything specific or provable. I'm also not willing to file it under coincidence and move on, the way I would have earlier in my life. Jung would have said that what I was experiencing wasn't random noise, that when a relationship carries genuine weight, the psychic field between two people doesn't end at the border of one person's skin, that something in one person can register something in another before the conscious mind has access to it. He wasn't careless about saying this. He was careful, precise, and honest about the limits of what he could demonstrate. But he wasn't willing to stop looking just because it was uncomfortable. I don't think that willingness was a weakness in him. I think it was the thing that made him worth reading. The 3 signs are easy to dismiss, one by one. the thought that arrived without cause, probably just free association, the restlessness in the body, stress, low blood sugar, nothing. The dream that left someone's emotional residue, just the brain cycling through its files. Any of those explanations may be right in a given instance, but Jung's point wasn't that every intrusion is meaningful, or that every restless moment is a signal, or that every dream is a message from somewhere outside yourself. His point was that the category, the genuine psychic resonance between people who matter to each other, is real, that it operates by mechanisms the conscious mind can't easily trace, and that the habit of dismissing everything equally isn't skepticism. It's just a different kind of not paying attention. There's someone in your mind right now, maybe from the last few days, maybe from longer ago, someone whose particular weight you'd recognize, even if you can't explain why they've been present. Jung would say, "Don't be so quick to explain that away. The signs are quiet. They were designed to be easy to miss. But you've been noticing them longer than you've been willing to admit."